Hello, everyone. I'm Raminder Somal with Wells Fargo Bank, and I am a Community Relations Senior Consultant supporting the East Bay. Our current giving strategy at Wells Fargo really focuses on three key areas: housing affordability, financial health, and small business growth. Within those three areas, looking at housing affordability, we're really working to reduce the burden of housing costs to increase access to safe, affordable places to live. Looking at financial health, we're really helping to improve the financial health of low to moderate income Americans through consumer education programs and innovative financial services. And last but certainly not least, small business growth. We strengthen communities and help create local jobs by investing in underserved small business owners.
I'm Trina Villanueva. I'm a corporate social responsibility officer at Union Bank. Our focus areas include community economic development, affordable housing, and what we're calling environmental stewardship and sustainability. And under community economic development, we are also looking at strategies to support small business development, workforce, and building economic security. We all know that affordable housing is really critical, not just in the Bay Area, but throughout the state. So that is a large portion of our work as well. So we support the development of affordable housing, and we're also trying to ensure that people have the strategies and skills needed to become homeowners as well. Where I think the environmental stewardship and sustainability goals intersect with the other two is that we look at potential projects that promote green jobs, and also looking at housing development that takes into account environmental stewardship and strategies.
Hello, my name is Chris Block. I'm the director of the Chronic Homelessness Initiative for the Tipping Point community. We're a foundation based in San Francisco funding the Bay Area. The Chronic Homelessness Initiative targets San Francisco. We're a $100 million fund. It's a 5-year initiative. We're in the third year. Our strategy, if you will, our giving strategy, is to fund high leverage opportunities in the homelessness response system. So if we see an area of where we could fund and therefore improve the homelessness response system, that's where we generally emphasize our funding. For instance, we have a $50 million effort with the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund to significantly lower the cost and the time to produce affordable housing. And I'll talk more about that actually as part of the panel discussion. Thank you. It's good to be here. Trina, I'd be interested to know how your giving strategy is supporting housing and green jobs through an equity lens.
Sure. And I think that's really important to consider these days, which is the intersectionality of, not just building housing, but really thinking about who's building the housing, who are the contractors for such development. And I think that from an equity lens, it's not just important to look at the grantees that we have. So of course, we're looking at housing developers that have had great track record, great impact in terms of their ability to build affordable housing. But who are the folks who are actually not just building housing, but they're partnering with organizations that may be training people to do the weatherization, the solar panel installation, and just making sure the HVAC systems that they put in place are all within the green building standards. And how are the housing developers partnering with organizations that may be able to produce the people that could build that for them? So maybe there's a partnership of some kind. And so these are the things that I look for when I looking at potential projects to support. So, we have had nonprofit developers tell us, for example, that they're looking at all of their properties and thinking about, is it time for them to refurbish, retrofit, and who's going to be able to do that and make sure that their tenants are going to benefit from it, from having lower energy costs. And then, the people who are going to be actually doing the work are people who are coming from the local communities where, they're building these developments. And Chris, I would like to ask you, actually, it sounds like you're doing a lot of great work under this initiative at Tipping Point. I would love to know how you are also looking at, fighting homelessness, building the housing needed, and also incorporating green jobs in that effort.
I'm going to speak specifically about the equity lens that we're bringing to this work. Part of our, as I said in our giving strategy, we're funding very particular programs at key intersection points in the homelessness response system to leverage transformation in those areas to make the system more responsive. So when we wanted to put renewed emphasis on equity, we worked with the Urban Institute to do a pretty extensive analysis of equity as it relates specifically to the homeless population. It's pretty common knowledge that 4% of San Franciscans are Black and 40% of homeless San Franciscans are Black. So as one example, there's a huge equity disparity there. So we actually did an analysis which allowed us to see how, on a 3-year basis, which is the life of the initiative, how much would we have to over-represent African Americans in our placements into housing to reduce disparities. So that we wanted to take a very sort of intentional and, even if you will, analytical approach to that. So what we're looking at in all of the supportive housing that we're building and all the supportive housing that we're creating for placement, in that our attempt is to over-represent, in this case, African Americans. So at the conclusion of the initiative, we've significantly reduced the disparity. Excuse me. I will tell you that's an effort in its initial phases. And part of the challenge, which is interesting from a policy perspective, part of the challenge we have is that it could be argued that over-representing African Americans in permanent supportive housing is actually in violation of fair housing law. So this is a great example where you have a dominant culture policy, which is actually creating an unintended barrier to achieving equity. So we not only have to have a giving strategy, but we have to have an overall policy strategy to try to change that in order to make the system more equitable.
Yeah, I can see that. Of course, coming from a financial institution, we're very cognizant of fair lending,
yes,
the Community Reinvestment Act, making sure that we are reaching low to moderate income populations as it relates to all of the services that we provide. But we also know that all financial institutions could do a way better job at increasing home lending and small business lending in communities of color. And so it's good to have legislation like fair lending in place. But we also know, like what you just mentioned, I agree with you that if we're going to look at it from an equity lens, what else can we do to ensure that you are serving the populations that are most underrepresented in, when it comes to like loans and programs. So it's certainly not an easy conversation to have. And certainly I can see the difficulty that you're probably going to be faced with if you're going to do that. And I imagine it's also an opportunity, though, for to be creative in the way that you want to address those inequities.
Well, you do bring up, I mean, it is precisely the issue that the notion that we are working in a system, certainly as it relates to housing in so many ways, that's fundamentally racist. And so if you're trying to use that same system to change racial disparities, to have greater equity, then you continually run up against these system-wide barriers to actually creating that. The system was not set up to be equitable, actually. So you're asking a system that was designed to create inequity to create equity. And so, first of all, it requires what we're doing, right? A fundamental discussion about root causes, and then the willingness for philanthropy and financial institutions and people in the housing industry to fundamentally challenge that system in a way that we have not actually been willing to do before.
Yeah, and I think, if we think about the overall topic for this conference, right, it has to do with recycling land. When we look at, land, for example, at waterfronts and, places where, that, private developers are going to be, chomping at the bit to look for, places like that because they know that they'll be able to make money off of that development. And, what we're thinking of in terms of from an equity lens, what are the places, in terms of infill development, most of these small pockets of property are going to be in low income communities, places where they could use it for parks and open space. If if you live in an SRO, your only option for outdoor activity could be a park next to you. And so redeveloping a land for parks is not going to be, market driven.
Yes.
It's going to be, it has to be somebody who is willing to provide, the resources so that, it could be developed into something, for other use, but it won't be, money maker for them.
Exactly.
So, but a lot of from an equity lens, right, a lot of these places in terms of what would be so useful to communities of color are going to be like these small pieces of property that somebody needs to develop in a way that's useful for the people who live there.
Absolutely. Raminder, it would be great to get a sense for how in your work you're supporting housing and green jobs through an equity lens.
Yeah, thanks so much. You know, Wells Fargo's perspective on supporting housing and green jobs through an equity lens, really ensuring our giving is from an equity lens, is really imperative to our work. And that's especially true for our lower income communities, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and other traditionally vulnerable populations who've been disproportionately lack housing, stable jobs, or financial products and services. So above and beyond just the products and services. As an example, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, year to date, 88% of our funding has supported low to moderate income populations, and 82% of our giving has supported communities of color. Another thing that I think that we're really looking at is leadership at these organizations. One of the things that's often seen is the board and the leaders of a nonprofit organization aren't necessarily representative of the communities that they're serving. So we've had some initiatives where there's been a leadership training, and we're particularly looking at leaders of color to provide that training to. Other ways that I can think of, there's an organization that I'd love to highlight, and that's La Luz in Santa Rosa or Sonoma County, led by Juan Hernandez. I've been supporting them for a number of years. And what La Luz is doing that's really exciting is they've partnered with the Santa Rosa Junior College and Sonoma County Office of Education, and they do an 8-week program to provide basic construction skills. And this has been especially helpful with the 2017 North Bay wildfires, where 5,000 homes were lost. So they're really training individuals in that industry. And one thing that's especially interesting to note about La Luz in particular is that 90% of the population that they serve are Latinx. And again, it's being led by someone who is Latinx as well. So that's just one example that I think demonstrates our ability to support housing and green jobs from an equity lens. But I'd love to see more of that. I'd love to see people of color becoming an executive director. So I think any work that we can do to create that pipeline, I think would be value added. So other examples that Wells Fargo has supported is grid alternatives.
Wells Fargo has been a major supporter of Oakland-based grid alternatives since 2012. Grid is a leading voice in low-income solar policy and the nation's largest nonprofit solar installer, serving families throughout California, Colorado, the Mid-Atlantic region, and tribal communities nationwide. But what I love about GRID is how it's also bringing solar power and workforce development opportunities to underserved communities and individuals. Since 2012, we've been supporting GRID's work, including the organization's national expansion and its Troop to Solar Veteran program. In addition to that, we've had our own Wells Fargo employees go out and volunteer alongside GRID alternatives to help build solar paneling or install solar paneling for families throughout California. So a lot of exciting work, and love that it has that workforce piece, green jobs, as well as housing.
So, we are supporting sustainability through, I want to specifically talk about the project that, the development project we're currently doing at 833 Bryant in San Francisco, south of Market. I think that is sustainable in a couple of different ways. It is sustainable as a development in San Francisco with all of the features of sustainability, with energy standards and the way that it's built and the rules and regulations, if you will, that we're following to achieve that. But I think probably more importantly, the most important way that it's being sustainable is that it's a classic urban infill project. And so the importance of that is that we were able to take a very underutilized parcel in the middle of the city and create 145 units for homeless folks. So the environmental footprint of that development is very small. For instance, we can provide a whole host of services, and people can transport themselves to and from the site environmentally in a way that does not leave a huge footprint. And I think that's probably, in a lot of ways, the most important sustainability feature of 833 Bryant.
That's great, Chris.
Thank you, Trina. Trina, do you want to talk a little bit more about your work regarding sustainability?
Sure. I was trying to think of recent examples in terms of organizations that we're supporting that really try to incorporate, equity, sustainability, and housing. One that I'll talk about right now is Emerald Cities. They're based actually in DC, but they have several offices throughout the country, led by a woman named Denise Fairchild, who did a lot of work in Los Angeles around community development. They have a Bay Area office. Their North Star, their vision for the organization is that people need what they call high road jobs. So jobs that are going to allow for them not just to gain a skill, say it's construction, but really be able to earn a wage that will allow them to, live, for example, here in the Bay Area. The other thing they're doing is they've partnered with nonprofit developers like Chinatown CDC, and to look at the properties that they have that need retrofitting to make them environmentally sustainable. And so they are partnering with the nonprofit developers to either install solar panels, to look at, the other energy usage ways that, people, their tenants can save money. And so they're partnering with nonprofits who are training people. So, Raminder mentioned Grid Alternatives. There's other organizations that train people in this field as well. And the most recent thing that they've asked us to support is what they're calling this e-contractor academy. It's adding who gets to bid on these types of projects and making sure that small businesses owned by women, people of color, disabled veterans, that they have a chance to bid on these projects as well, so that they are also part of this ecosystem of retrofitting, affordable housing development, making sure that they get to be, their contractors are also representative of the community that they live in, and the people who actually, let's say, install the solar panels are also from the community, trained locally. So it's an organization that I've been working with for the last few years, and really admire, this vision that they have of really incorporating all of those areas so that it could be beneficial to the local area. And I know that there's some other nonprofit housing developers that are, as the age of their development is showing signs of aging, I guess, that they're using this opportunity to incorporate, the weatherization and other things to make sure that it's more energy efficient.
So Wells Fargo's role for supporting organizations doing small site housing development, really within the context of the larger crisis and market, we're really seeking out organizations making an impact in small site housing development, as it's another tool in the housing affordability tool belt to create solutions. As one example, Wells Fargo has supported the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund since 2018, and the fund's really providing unique and important financing for the city's small site programs preservation work. Since its inception in 2017, San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund has executed 21 preservation loans in the city and county of San Francisco. In addition, just recently, I brought together a group of housing experts to host a housing forum for 6 nonprofits in the East Bay. Each of the 6 organizations are trying to create small-scale housing solutions for their clients. At the forum, the 6 executive directors pitched their housing plans to Oakland Community Land Trust and East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, or EVPREC, to receive tips on how they can strengthen their plans to create housing for their clients. So while this might be small scale, the impact to these families is truly monumental. Chris, I'd love to learn from you, what role does your organization play in helping develop small site housing development within the context of the larger crisis and market?
Thank you very much, Raminder. I also want to just emphasize the role of the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund. We are also a major investor of the fund and have been extremely impressed with their ability to use nimble financing to create opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. I think Tipping Point Chronic Homelessness Initiative feels that its role, as I mentioned before, is to do, and I would say we're on the upper end of small site development. It's a relatively small site because we're using very small rooms. The total project that unit count of the project I'm going to talk about is 145, but they're again very small studio apartments for formerly homeless folks. And I think that if we were just developing a traditional studio apartment complex, it would have value for that 145 people. But we really feel like if we're going to address the larger crisis and the housing market, that we have to do development differently, and that we have to utilize land differently and more effectively. And that often takes not only development, but policy. So in the case of 833 Bryant, the first thing that we did was work with Supervisor Jane Kim, and we got a particular zoning change south of Market, which is actually a light industrial zone, which allowed for, when we were building 100% affordable developments, it allowed for us, in effect, by right, to develop those properties on underutilized land, particularly on parking lots. So we're building 833 Bryant in a small parking lot space right across from the Hall of Justice in a semi-industrial area, although there is increasing for-profit residential development in the area as well. So the first thing we had to do was get a zoning change, which allowed us to more effectively use land south of Market. The second thing that we did was we used very effectively SB 35, which is Scott Wiener's legislation that allows us almost by right, with certain requirements, to build 145, to build 100% affordable housing without the same kind of review process that most residential development has to go through. So we were able to implement SB 35 as well. And what that allowed us to do is a traditional affordable housing development could take upwards to 5 years to build. And matter of fact, that's probably the normal course of time, 5 years. We're going to do that in half the time. We're also going to do it at 2/3 of the cost. That has a lot to do with the modular technology, but it also has a lot to do with the timing and the nimble financing we're using. So I think that the utilization of small sites in urban areas is important in and of itself, because that's oftentimes the only land available. And so what we see as our role, right, as a philanthropic investor, is to not only do that development to house 145 people, but to do it in such a way that the policy context in the community has changed significantly, so more of that development those types of developments can occur at significantly reduced price and much faster. And that's what we were able to do at 833 Bryant. So I guess, again, to reiterate, if you will, we really see our role as investing in opportunities that will change the context in which we're working and other people are working, so that we can do the work we're doing much more effectively. Because, $100 million seems like a lot of money going in, but when you look at the scope of the problem, right, it's certainly not enough money unless we're spending it in such a way that changes the system that we're working in and makes it more effective. And that was the approach we took at 833 Bryant.
That's awesome. I love how you are working, with policy and with elected officials, because I think that's really something that I've learned in recent years really helps move the needle. So I commend you. I think that's great, and the impact that you're making for those 145 individuals.
Yes, we're looking forward to that, certainly. And Trina, could you talk a little bit about your role in doing small site housing development, particularly within the context of this larger crisis and the current housing market?
Sure. Like my fellow panelists here today, we also have been supporting the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund since its inception. When we were presented, when I found out about the fund, and having worked for the city of San Francisco before coming to Union Bank, I knew that this was a vehicle that could really benefit San Francisco. In my role as the corporate social responsibility officer at Union Bank, I covered Northern California and the Central Valley. So essentially, Redding to Bakersfield. And to my knowledge, there isn't a housing accelerator fund like the one that's in San Francisco, and it makes a difference. Like with them partnering with groups like Meta, Chinatown CDC. It just makes things go faster. They're able to be, like Chris said, be really nimble in the way they do things. Folks are trying to do things here in Oakland, and because there isn't a fund similar to it, it just they're not able to do the things that they want to do at the same rate. And so, I would love to see something of this, something similar in places, not just here in the East Bay, but could be in Fresno or in Sacramento, where it's becoming more difficult to live in places like downtown Sacramento or in Fresno. And this is an issue that is really statewide. Of course, it's nationwide, but as we look at California, small site development and the ability to keep multifamily housing affordable for families is going to be really, really important to prevent, more homeless, more eviction. So, that's another thing that we haven't even touched on as it relates to the pandemic, and moratoriums are ending. Even people who are homeowners now are, most deferral plans, most forbearances are ending. So, what is the strategy that families need to take so that they can stay in the places where they live? And that is going to take policy, for sure. Policy and organizing are going to be important to make that happen. So I would love to see more small site development happen as it relates to this crisis.
One of the most significant issues for the affordable housing industry in the last 5 to 10 years has been the demise of redevelopment agencies. And so I think I see that with two perspectives, if you will. The loss of redevelopment created a large resource gap that as good as groups like the San Francisco Housing Accelerator Fund are, they can't replace that gap. And that's because when we're talking about true affordability, you really need good lenders, you need construction loans, you need very low interest rate loans, but you really need loans that also act as equity. That a significant part of creating affordability is free money, because that reduces rents to the point where rents are paying for operations. And so to the degree that there was a lot more, if you will, deferred financing as a result of redevelopment, we took a huge hit in that regard. I do want to say, though, that I think this notion that if we just had more money, we could solve this crisis is one that has to be challenged. You know, in California in the last 30 years, there were times when as a developer, it seemed like we had more money than we could spend. I mean, we really had a lot of resources, particularly when we were passing bonds one after another for affordable housing. And we never bent the cost curve. We never significantly reduced rents. And we never significantly addressed the problem of the affordability crisis for the vast majority of Californians. So I just want to reiterate that we need the resources represented previously by redevelopment agencies, but we need to learn to deploy them in a different way. We need to provide housing faster and cheaper. We need to be more open to shallow rent subsidies using those funds for a much larger share of Californians. And we need not to let production of housing become a single-minded focus that shuts off our openness to look at other policy considerations like rent control, which I know is a hot-button issue, but I will challenge people that the only thing that has really bent the cost curve for a significant number of San Franciscans in the city is rent control, not the production of more affordable housing. And I'm not saying that rent control, we shouldn't have a single-minded focus on rent control either. But we should be open to these larger policy considerations if we truly want to have the kind of impact on affordability that will make a difference to the vast majority of Californians.
My hopes and dreams for housing in California are, that we finally get rid of that NIMBYism. And I think we're slowly getting there. I feel hopeful. I feel, I think it was in 2016 when here in Alameda County, we were able to pass the A1 measure to bring housing more dollars for housing. And I think it was passed at 2/3, which, is no small feat. And I think we're finally there where people are really understanding that this is an issue for all walks of life. So my hope is that continues to evolve and that racial equity stays front and center to all of this work. I think the other thing that some of my panelists have mentioned that I would just reiterate is the significant cost of housing. When it costs roughly $670,000 per unit, that's just not sustainable. And so how do we change that? And there's several pieces to that equation, and I think we really need to tackle that. That is my hope, is that we tackle that equation so that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it isn't going to cost, $670-some thousand. Maybe it's 300,000. I don't know, but reducing that number so that we are able to do, and in a shorter time frame. I think what's been the silver lining of this pandemic is statewide programs like Operation Room Key and Home Key. Housing should be considered a pandemic. How do we escalate issues sort of from that lens that this is a health crisis? And I think that's what my hope is, that people really see this as this is in and of itself a pandemic, and that people, policymakers, affordable housing developers, the community at large, elected officials, really take all of the steps to reduce the cost as well as increase development.
I actually started my career many years ago in brownfields development. My first job out of graduate school about 25 years ago was working at the Green Lining Institute, looking at brownfields and driving through South Central LA, driving through the San Fernando Valley, and places all throughout the Bay Area where you see people living next to light industrial, where zoning was, because they were low-income communities, they didn't care what kind of zoning, they didn't pay attention to people living next to places where they shouldn't have been, because then that impacted their health that impacted their ability to, bring in businesses. And, like I said earlier, these are sites that are difficult to develop because of the regulations, around, what level of contamination might there be and what level of cleanup there has to be. And that's a lot. That's a lot for small municipalities, smaller housing developers take on. And so, and that's why I really appreciate, C-Clear being around, because I do feel like you provide that I'm going to make a plug for C-Clear here. You make that easier for these developers to understand. But my hopes and dreams, for for especially as it relates to racial equity and social justice, is that people, no matter who they are, what families they're born into, that they have the ability to be they have the opportunity to be successful, no matter who they are, that they go to schools that, look like schools in other places. And so I appreciate movements that are trying to make schools more green, less, just blacktops, and making sure that kids are going to a school that is allowing them to play. I have hopes and dreams for people to be able to live in the communities where they want and not be pushed out. And I have hopes and dreams that, especially in light of this pandemic, that, small businesses that want to stay in the neighborhoods where they're in now, that they can survive this pandemic and that they get to stay and serve the communities where they are. I know that's a lot, but I feel like there's so much going on right now. And but to me, they're all related in terms of creating communities that are going to be, welcoming to all people, no matter who they are.
I've been doing this work now since the advent of tax credits in 1987. I was a developer for most of that time. And the hope that we had then was that we would produce enough housing so that there was not an affordability crisis for large segments of the population who are working hard to live their lives and to raise families. And what we created, quite frankly, was an industry that produces a product that costs too much and takes too much time in order to achieve that objective. And so I think there's a couple things that I hope for, particularly as it pertains to homelessness, but as it pertains to all low-income people, particularly low-income communities of color. The first is that we have to find a different way to do development. And if we continue to rely on the same system with the same productivity levels and the same technology, then we will continue to produce studio apartments in San Francisco that take 5, 6, 7, 8 years and cost $600,000 a unit. And so we create a dynamic in San Francisco where you either live under the bridge or we build you a $600,000 studio apartment. That's not a solution set that most people in the world would think is rational. The other thing I hope for is that we can step back from an almost single-minded reliance on actually housing production as the overall solution to this problem. It has really taken all of the air out of the policy discussion around housing as far as I'm concerned. There's an over-reliance on supply and demand, and supply and demand has not been shown in high-cost areas to create affordability. There is a hesitancy to accept policy considerations like rent control because of this over-reliance on supply and demand. And there's also a hesitancy to look at other policy strategies like a much more comprehensive shallow subsidy program for really low-income people throughout California. So my hope is that we will step back from the current strategy and acknowledge that after 30 years, we're still talking about a larger crisis in the housing market. You could have asked the same question 30 years ago, actually. And so my hope is that we step back, recognizing that we need to build good affordable housing, and tax credits and bonds and that kind of financing can still play a role. And we need to do that very effectively with small site development like we're doing at 833 Bryant. But my hope is that we'll also step back and say, what will it really take to solve this problem of affordability for the vast majority of really poor Californians, and then have the courage to actually implement that set of policies, so that in 5 years, when we're having this conference again and we're all on the same panel, you're not really asking how we're trying to address the larger crisis in the affordable housing market, because we are addressing it and we're showing significant progress toward that goal. That's my hope.